From an army of inflatable tanks, to a dead man carrying fake invasion plans, to 9 men on skis who stopped a nuclear bomb. These are war tactics so crazy, they actually worked, and as this video progresses, they just get more and more crazy. The Roman Testudo. The Roman army was already one of the most feared fighting forces in the ancient world. But even they had a problem. Arrows, rocks, things thrown from walls. So they solved it the way Romans solved most problems, with discipline and geometry. The testudo, or tortoise formation, had soldiers lock their shields together into a solid shell. Front row facing forward, side rows angled out, everyone else lifting their shields flat overhead. The result was a slow-moving armored box that could walk directly into a hail of projectiles and come out the other side intact. It looked absurd. It worked every time. And it worked because Roman soldiers trained hard enough to hold the formation under real pressure, which was the part most armies couldn't copy. Quaker guns. During the American Civil War, outnumbered Confederate forces had a problem. They needed to hold positions they didn't have enough men or guns to defend, so they carved cannons out of logs, painted them black, and pointed them at the enemy. These were called Quaker guns, named after the pacifist religious group as a dry joke about weapons that would never fire. They held up enemy advances, delayed attacks, and bought time on multiple occasions. Union commanders, staring through field glasses at what looked like a fortified artillery position, chose caution. The bluff was eventually discovered every time, but by then, it had already done its job. The geese of Rome. In 390 BC, a force of Gauls crept up the Capitoline Hill in the dark, moving silently enough to get past the Roman sentries undetected. What they didn't account for was the sacred geese kept in the Temple of Juno at the top. Geese are loud, territorial, and impossible to sneak past. They erupted into noise, woke the garrison, and the attack failed. Ancient sources record that the geese were afterward honored and fed at public expense, while the general whose dogs had slept through the whole thing was executed. Whether every detail is precisely accurate is debated by historians, but the event is broadly accepted and the logic is sound. Geese are genuinely better sentinels than they have any right to be. The Viet Cong tunnel system. The United States military in Vietnam had helicopters, napalm, Agent Orange, and the most sophisticated logistical operation in the history of warfare. The Viet Cong had shovels. Over decades, they dug hundreds of miles of tunnels beneath the Vietnamese countryside, wide enough for a person to move through, deep enough to survive bombing runs directly overhead. The tunnels held hospitals, weapons caches, command centers, and sleeping quarters. Fighters could appear from the ground, attack, and vanish before a response was possible. American forces sent soldiers called tunnel rats into the passages to clear them. It was some of the most dangerous work of the war. The tunnels were never fully neutralized, and they remained a decisive factor throughout the conflict. Low technology, applied with patience and total commitment, defeated high technology at nearly every turn. The Finnish Winter War tactics. In November of 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland with roughly 450,000 troops. Finland had around 300,000 soldiers total, many of them reservists. The outcome looked like a formality. Instead, Finland held out for 105 days and inflicted staggering casualties. Finnish soldiers used small, fast ski units to encircle Soviet columns moving slowly through frozen forests, cutting them into isolated pockets and destroying them piece by piece. This was called the Mahti tactic. Combined with extreme cold that the Soviets were catastrophically unprepared for, and Finnish marksmanship that proved devastating in the dense terrain, the result was one of the most lopsided defensive performances of the 20th century. The Soviets eventually broke through and Finland conceded territory, but the Red Army's performance was so poor it convinced Hitler that the Soviet Union was weak, a miscalculation that shaped the entire rest of the war. Hannibal at Cannae. In 216 BC, a Roman army of somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men marched to destroy Hannibal's Carthaginian force, which was significantly smaller. The Romans did what they always did. They pushed forward in a dense mass, expecting to overwhelm the center. Hannibal had designed the entire battle around that instinct. He placed his weakest troops in the middle and let them bend backward under Roman pressure, while his strongest cavalry and infantry wrapped around both flanks. As the Romans poured forward into what felt like a victory, the Carthaginian wings closed behind them. What followed was one of the most complete destructions of an army in recorded history. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon, packed so tightly they could barely raise their weapons. Cannae became the template for encirclement tactics studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. Thermopylae. In 480 BC, a Persian army estimated by ancient sources in the millions, and by modern historians at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, needed to pass through a coastal mountain pass called Thermopylae to invade Greece. The pass was roughly 15 meters wide at its narrowest point. King Leonidas of Sparta chose to hold it with approximately 7,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. In that narrow space, numbers meant almost nothing. The Persians couldn't bring their full force to bear, and for 2 days, the Greek line held. They were eventually betrayed. A local man showed the Persians a path around the pass, and the defenders died. But the delay bought the Greek fleet time to regroup, and the psychological impact of the stand altered the entire trajectory of the campaign. It was not a victory, but as a tactic, using terrain to neutralize a vastly larger force, it was close to perfect. The charge at Beersheba. In October of 1917, British Empire forces in the Middle East needed the wells at Beersheba. Without water, the entire campaign ground to a halt. The Ottoman and German defensive position was fortified, and a conventional assault was expected. Instead, the 4th Australian Light Horse Brigade charged across open ground at full gallop, nearly 5 kilometers, toward fixed defensive positions with rifles and bayonets. The charge was so fast that the defenders, trained to aim at slower-moving targets, couldn't adjust their rifle sights in time. The horsemen were over the trenches before accurate fire could be brought to bear. The wells were taken intact. The campaign continued. It remains one of the last successful cavalry charges in history, and it worked almost entirely because it was too fast and too aggressive to counter. Vlad's night raid. In June of 1462, Vlad III of Wallachia, the historical figure behind the Dracula legend, led a night cavalry raid directly into the Ottoman camp with the specific goal of killing Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad was outnumbered roughly 10-1. The raid caused complete chaos. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers died in the confusion, some killed by their own side in the darkness. Vlad missed Mehmed, who had been moved to a different tent, but the psychological damage was severe enough that the Ottomans temporarily withdrew. Vlad also lined the road to his capital with the impaled bodies of previously captured Ottoman soldiers, somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 of them, partly as a defensive measure, and partly to break Mehmed's will to continue. It worked. Mehmed turned back. One of the most powerful rulers in the world retreated from a man whose entire army fit inside his enemy's camp. Greek fire. Sometime in the 7th century AD, the Byzantine Empire deployed a weapon that nobody has fully reverse-engineered since. Greek fire was an incendiary substance that ignited on contact with water, burned through almost anything, and couldn't be extinguished by conventional means. It was sprayed from pressurized nozzles mounted on ships. It saved Constantinople at least twice from naval sieges that would otherwise have ended the empire. Enemy fleets that sailed confidently into Byzantine waters found their ships burning from the waterline up with no way to stop it. The exact formula was a state secret so closely guarded that it was eventually lost entirely. Modern chemists have proposed various combinations of ingredients, but none have fully replicated its properties. The Byzantines took the recipe to the grave, and the weapon died with them. Operation Gunnerside. In February of 1943, 9 Norwegian commandos skied into the mountains above a facility called Vemork, which the Nazis were using to produce heavy water, a key component in their attempt to build a nuclear weapon. They descended a near-vertical ravine, crossed a frozen river, climbed the opposite cliff face, and entered the facility through a cable tunnel. They placed their charges, got out, and skied 140 kilometers to Sweden through a Norwegian winter. Not a single shot was fired during the raid itself. The heavy water plant was destroyed. The Nazi nuclear program was set back significantly, and when the facility was later rebuilt, a subsequent attack sank the ferry carrying its entire remaining stock across a lake. 9 men, skis, and the right charges in the right place, and one of the most dangerous weapons programs in history was stopped cold. The Mongol feigned retreat. The Mongol army used the feigned retreat so consistently and so successfully that it almost stops being a trick and starts being something closer to a formula. Cavalry units would engage an enemy, then suddenly turn and flee. The opposing force, seeing victory, would break formation and pursue. Then the Mongols would wheel around. The pursuing soldiers were now scattered, out of formation, and exhausted from the chase. The Mongol cavalry, still disciplined and coordinated, would encircle and destroy them. This tactic was used across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, China, and the Middle East with near-identical results each time, against enemies who had often been warned it was coming and still fell for it. The combination of horsemanship, coordination, and the sheer human instinct to chase a fleeing enemy made it almost unstoppable. The Ghost Army. In 1944, the United States military assembled a unit of roughly 2,000 men. artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, and advertising professionals, and sent them to Europe with a very specific mission. They were to impersonate an entire armored division of 40,000 men. They did it with inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, recorded sound effects of heavy machinery played through powerful speakers, and theatrical costuming designed to make a handful of jeeps look like a convoy. They performed over 20 deception operations, moving up and down the front to convince German commanders that American forces were positioned where they weren't. It worked. German units repositioned in response to a threat that was made of rubber and noise, freeing up real American forces to operate elsewhere. The Ghost Army remained classified for more than 50 years. Operation Fortitude. Before the D-Day landings in June of 1944, the Allies needed the Germans to believe the invasion was coming at Pas de Calais, not Normandy, so they built a fake army. Operation Fortitude created the first United States Army group, complete with General George Patton in command, dummy landing craft in the Thames estuary, fabricated radio traffic, and a network of double agents feeding false intelligence directly to German high command. Hitler believed in it so completely that even after the Normandy landings began, he held his best armored divisions at Calais for weeks, waiting for the real attack. Those divisions never came. By the time the Germans accepted the truth, the Allied beachhead was secure, one of the most elaborate lies in military history, and it held long enough to change everything. The Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes. In May of 1940, France had one of the largest armies in the world, a formidable defensive line, and a reasonable expectation of where Germany would attack. The Maginot Line covered the Franco-German border. The open terrain of Belgium was the obvious invasion route. The Germans went through the Ardennes, a heavily forested, hilly region that French military planners had assessed as impassable for armored units. It wasn't impassable, it was difficult. And while the French focused their best forces on Belgium, an enormous armored column emerged from the trees behind them, cut to the English Channel, and trapped the entire Allied Northern Army. France fell in 6 weeks. The plan worked not because the terrain was easy, but because no one believed it was possible. And by the time they did, it was already done. Vlad's psychological warfare, the Forest of the Impaled. This is separate from the night raid. When Mehmed II's army marched toward Vlad's capital, they encountered something that stopped them cold long before any military engagement. Along the road, stretching for kilometers, were the impaled bodies of around 20,000 people, primarily previously captured Ottoman soldiers and prisoners. Ancient and medieval commanders used psychological tactics regularly, but this was something different in scale and deliberateness. Mehmed, by multiple accounts, was visibly shaken. His army's morale collapsed. He turned back. Vlad had no conventional means of stopping the Ottoman advance, so he used fear as infrastructure. It was monstrous and calculated, and it achieved a military objective that conventional defense could not. Operation Anthropoid. In May of 1942, 2 SOE-trained agents, Jan Kubisch and Josef Gabčík, ambushed Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, in the streets of Prague. Heydrich died of his wounds 8 days later. He was the most senior Nazi official to be killed by enemy action during the entire war, and his death disrupted SS operations and planning at a critical moment. The cost was enormous. The Nazis destroyed the village of Lidice and killed over 1,300 Czechs in reprisals. Kubisch and Gabčík died in their final stand. 2 men in a foreign city, armed with a Sten gun and a grenade, had reached into the heart of the Nazi Empire and removed one of its most dangerous figures. The mission proved that no one was untouchable. The Mongols and the plague catapult. In 1346, Mongol forces besieging the Crimean city of Kaffa were struck by an outbreak of plague. Facing the collapse of their siege, they did something that would change the course of human history. They loaded the corpses of plague victims into their catapults and launched them over the city walls. Whether this alone caused what followed is debated by historians, but Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa are widely considered one of the primary vectors that brought the Black Death to Western Europe. The plague killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population over the following years. It may be the single most consequential military decision ever made, a siege tactic that accidentally became one of the deadliest events in human history. Operation Mincemeat. In April of 1943, a British submarine surfaced off the coast of Spain and released the body of a dead man into the sea. The man had no pulse because he had been dead for several weeks, but he had a name: Major William Martin. A briefcase, a fiancé's photograph, personal letters, and documents outlining a fake Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia. He washed ashore. Spanish authorities passed the documents to German intelligence. Hitler personally redirected forces away from Sicily, the actual invasion target, to Greece and Sardinia. When the Allies landed in Sicily in July, the defenses were undermanned. A dead man who had never existed changed the course of the Second World War. The operation was the brainchild of British intelligence officer Ewan Montagu, and it worked so completely that even after the Sicily landings, some German commanders still believed Mincemeat's fake documents were genuine. 9 men, skis, and a nuclear bomb. Everything about Operation Gunnerside was improbable. 9 men against a hardened industrial target in winter in occupied Norway with no extraction plan beyond their own legs and skis. But here's what makes it the single craziest tactic on this list: the stakes. If the Vemork plant had continued producing heavy water unimpeded, Nazi Germany may have developed a functional nuclear weapon before the United States. The implications of that are almost impossible to calculate. 9 men didn't just destroy a facility, they may have altered the entire outcome of the war, and with it, the shape of the modern world. No inflatable tanks, no dead spies, no elaborate deception networks, just 9 people, a frozen mountain, and the right explosives in the right place. The simplest plan on this list, aimed at the highest possible target. That's what makes it number 1.